dig a hole anywhere in the northern plains of Nebraska, not a shallow scratch, but a real hole, 4 feet down into the clay and glacial till, and something strange happens. The ground stops following the weather. Right now, in the dead of January, that soil sits at roughly 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Not 3 degrees, not frozen solid. 43. It doesn't care what's happening above it. A blizzard screaming at -28 can rage for a week up top, and 4 feet down, nothing changes. People know this now. We call it geothermal buffering. We build earth-sheltered homes around it. Passive house architects run equations about it. But in the winter of 1880, one woman in Holt County, Nebraska, already understood it, not from a textbook, not from a university, but from watching what happened to the things she pushed underground versus the things she left above it. And what she did with that understanding kept her 3 children alive through one of the longest, most lethal winters in recorded American history. Her name was Britta Sundqvist. She was 31 years old, Swedish-born, arrived through the port of New York in April of 1873 with her husband Anders, $11.40 between them, and no English beyond the words Nebraska and Homestead. By October of 1880, she had neither the $11 nor the husband. What she had was a 160-acre claim on the Elkhorn River's east side, 3 children aged 4, 7, and 9, and a rusted iron water tank her in-laws had left behind on purpose because they believed it was worthless. They were wrong about almost everything that winter. She was right about almost all of it. Anders Sundqvist died on the 8th of September, 1880. Not from cold, from a corn knife. He was clearing the last of the late-season stalks when the blade skipped off a knot in the stalk base and opened his left leg from the knee to the mid-thigh. He bled for 6 hours. The nearest physician was in O'Neill, 19 miles south, and the wagon track that connected the claim to O'Neill was a single rutted path through tall grass that turned to mud when it rained, and it had been raining for 4 days. By the time Britta's neighbour Lars Hoffman rode hard to O'Neill and back with the doctor, Anders had been dead for 3 hours. She buried him on the east side of the claim, near the line of cottonwoods by the Elkhorn. She dug the hole herself because Lars Hoffman had dislocated his shoulder on the ride back and couldn't swing a spade. 9-year-old Emil watched her dig and didn't say a word. What happened next happened fast, the way bad things do in the fall on the plains when you don't have time to stop. Anders's parents, Gunnar and Helsa Sundqvist, arrived from their own claim 11 miles north on September 22nd. Gunnar was 63, lean, with the kind of face that had been weathered so long it looked like it had been carved from a wagon board. Helsa said almost nothing on the visit. What Gunnar said was clear. The claim, under the terms Anders had registered it, listed Anders alone as the filing person. Britta had never been added. Under the Homestead Act of 1862, the claim would need to be refiled, and Gunnar intended to refile it for himself because he said Anders would have wanted family land to stay in family hands. This was not entirely accurate, and it was not entirely legal, but Gunnar had ridden to O'Neill 3 days earlier to speak with the land commissioner, and the land commissioner who knew Gunnar from the Norwegian Lutheran church they both attended. Though Gunnar was Swedish and the distinction apparently didn't matter, had told him informally that the situation was complicated but workable. Britta had until November 1st to vacate the main cabin. She was given use of the southeast quarter 40 acres of the original 160, the section nearest the Elkhorn, the section prone to flooding in spring, the section with the lowest soil quality. She was also given, because Gunnar apparently felt magnanimous, use of any outbuildings or equipment remaining on the quarter. What remained on the southeast quarter was a single structure, the iron water tank. The tank had come to the claim in the spring of 1878, hauled up from the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad line on a borrowed wagon by Anders and 2 men from the settlement at Atkinson. It was a riveted iron cylinder, horizontal, roughly 9 feet in diameter and 17 feet long, the kind of tank that railroad construction crews used in the 1870s for water supply at line camps before permanent infrastructure went in. When a line camp moved, the tanks sometimes got left, sometimes got sold to whoever would haul them. Anders paid $8 for it and spent 3 weeks getting it onto the claim. His original intention was to use it as a grain cistern, to keep seed wheat dry and away from the field mice that had destroyed 2 seasons of stored grain in canvas sacks. He set it on a slight rise near the Elkhorn, propped on 2 flat limestone rocks at each end so it wouldn't roll, and cut a hatch in the top with a cold chisel. It worked tolerably for grain storage. It worked poorly as anything else, and by 1880 it smelled of old wheat, iron rust, and river mud, and the neighborhood children had started calling it the dead whale because of the way it sat immovable in the grass with its convex sides and corroded grey-brown skin. When Gunnar looked at the southeast quarter on September 22nd and told Britta she could have use of any outbuildings, he was specifically thinking of the tank. His exact words, according to what Britta later told her daughter Astrid, were, "That iron thing is your concern now. Do with it what you can." He meant it as a dismissal. Britta spent the last 2 weeks of October moving. She had $11 she'd kept hidden in a flour tin under the floorboards. Anders's emergency money, which Gunnar didn't know existed, and she used 4 of those dollars to hire Lars Hoffman's eldest son, Petter, and a man named Reuben Cherney from the Atkinson settlement to help her haul what she needed from the main cabin to the southeast quarter before November 1st. She brought the cast-iron cook stove. She brought the wood box, 4 wool blankets, the children's bedding, 2 months of flour and salt pork, her sewing kit, Anders's carpentry tools, a coil of rope, and a hand axe. She did not bring the cabin's furniture, because it wouldn't fit where she was going. Petter Hoffman saw where she was setting up around the tank, not inside it, and he said plainly that he thought she had lost her mind from grief. Reuben Cherney said nothing but looked at the tank and then at Britta and then away, the way men did in 1880 when they thought something was doomed but didn't want to be the one to say it aloud. What Britta was doing with the tank, what she had spent 2 weeks planning while she was still hauling water and feeding the children and trying to sleep in a bed that was 1 person too empty, was something she'd worked out from 3 different things she already knew. The first was something she'd noticed every spring since 1874. The section of the east bank of the Elkhorn where the ground sloped down into the riverbed stayed unfrozen 2 full weeks longer than the flat ground above it, not because of the water's warmth, because the ground there was lower and dirt from higher up had banked against it over the years, and that earth was thick and still and not exposed to wind. The second thing she knew was that in the winter of 1876, when a 3-day blizzard had hit in February, she had found her 3 laying hens, which she'd forgotten were in the bottom of a feed barrel, with a broken lid alive and relatively warm. On the 3rd morning, huddled together in the corner of the barrel, while the 2 chickens she'd had in the open coop were frozen. The barrel was wood, not even particularly thick, but it was enclosed. Their own heat had stayed with them. The third thing she knew was what had happened the previous January when a bobcat had killed her last 2 goats in the night. The goat shed, which had been housing the animals for 4 months, was noticeably warm when she opened it in the morning and found the carcasses. Warm, not from fire, there was no fire in the goat shed. Warm because 2 living animals generating heat in an enclosed 10-foot square space in 4 months had essentially trained the surrounding earth and the sod walls to hold that temperature. None of these 3 things were connected in her mind in a formal way. She had not read a physics textbook. There were no physics textbooks at the Holt County Land Office. but she had paid attention for 6 years, the way people pay attention when their lives depend on it, and she had connected the dots herself. The tank was metal. Metal alone would be useless. It would draw heat out of a living space faster than wood did, because iron conducts heat at roughly 50 watts per meter Kelvin, while a wooden wall conducts at only 0.12. An iron tank sitting above ground with wind hitting it would be a refrigerator, not a home. But that wasn't how she was thinking about using it. She was thinking about using it the way the earth used the goat shed. She started in the last week of October, with 3 feet of frost-free time left in the ground before the hard freeze came. The first thing she did was dig. Not a hole for the tank was staying where it was, on its limestone props. She dug a perimeter trench around the tank, 2 feet out from the iron wall on all sides, 4 feet deep. 3 days of digging, with Emil, 9 years old, helping carry the loosened soil away in a wooden box by a rope handle. The clay came up in chunks. By the end of the 3rd day, the tank sat in a shallow trench moat, its iron sides exposed but surrounded on all sides by open earth. Then she started banking. Banking was not a new idea on the Nebraska plains. Settlers routinely piled straw or earth against the north wall of a cabin before winter to cut the wind. What Britta was doing was different in scale and in intention. She wanted to bury the tank. Over the next 8 days, she and Emil and 7-year-old Karin piled material against the tank's sides. First, a layer of fresh horse manure from Lars Hoffman's stable, which Petter Hoffman hauled over in a borrowed wagon a full load, roughly 2 tons of wet manure and straw bedding. She packed it 2 feet thick against the lower half of the iron sides, and into the trench she dug, tamping it down hard. On top of that went a mixture of dry prairie sod, cut in 6-inch chunks, laid grass down like a brick course, working up the curve of the tank's sides until the top of the tank, the hatch she was going to use as a door, was the only thing exposed. On top of the sod went a second layer of loose straw, 4 to 6 inches thick, stuffed into every gap between the sod blocks. Then she shoveled the clay she'd excavated back over all of it, mounding it up over the straw until the tank looked like a low earth hill with a hatch sticking out of its back. What she had built, without naming it, was a double envelope system with geothermal coupling. Here is what that means in plain terms. The earth 4 feet down in Holt County, Nebraska, in 1880, sat at approximately 43 degrees Fahrenheit all winter, not cold enough to feel warm to a hand used to room temperature. But 43 degrees is not 10 below zero. It is not 20 below. It is not even freezing. When a blizzard drove the surface temperature to -28, the earth 4 feet down was still 43 degrees. And that 4-3-degree earth, pressed against 2 tons of straw and sod and manure, pressed against the iron wall, was constantly feeding mild heat into the system. The manure contributed something extra. Fresh manure composting even slowly, even in near-freezing conditions, generates biological heat. The reaction is exothermic. As bacteria break down organic material, they release energy as heat. A 2-ton pile of horse manure actively composting doesn't get hot enough to feel warm on the outside, but it produces somewhere between 50 and 100 watts per cubic meter of biological heat continuously. Not enough to heat a room, but enough to keep the iron wall from ever dropping to outside temperature. The iron tank itself, 9 feet across, 17 feet long, enclosed a volume of roughly 1,080 cubic feet. That's not large. It's about the size of a 1-car garage. But it was sealed. The riveted seams, which she caulked from the inside with a mixture of pine tar and river clay she found in a tar and brush kit Anders had stored in the tool chest, let almost no air pass. She fitted the top hatch, the original grain access door, with a heavy canvas flap weighted at the bottom and tied shut with rope, and cut a second, smaller ventilation hole near the far end, plugged with a straw bundle she could pull out when she needed to. Inside the tank, she set up the cook stove small cast iron, its flue pipe going up through a clay-sealed hole she cut in the upper curve of the tank wall. The stove was not intended to be the primary heat source. She made that decision deliberately. The problem with relying on a stove through a Dakota Plains winter was fuel. She had 1 cord of cut cottonwood. 1 cord burns in roughly 60 days when a stove runs all day. The winter of 1880, she had every reason to believe, was not going to be 60 days. The primary heat source was going to be the animals. In the second week of November, after the first serious cold, a dry, still freeze that dropped the overnight temperature to 11 degrees above zero, Britta opened the hatch, spread fresh straw across half the tank's floor, and moved her 2 remaining milk cows inside. Their names were Kirsten and Fru. Kirsten was 6 years old, about 1,100 pounds, red-brown with a white patch over her left shoulder. Fru was older, a little smaller, nearly dry in terms of milk production by November. Britta had considered selling Fru before winter, but hadn't found a buyer at a price she'd accept, and now she was grateful for that. A cow of Kirsten's size and metabolic rate produces approximately 3,500 British thermal units of heat per hour. That is not a guess. That is the documented heat output of a dairy cow at low production, a number modern animal scientists and agricultural engineers have verified repeatedly across multiple studies. It is, for comparison, roughly equivalent to a 1,000-watt electric space heater running continuously. Fru, slightly smaller and dry, produced somewhat less, call it 2,800 B2 per hour. Together in a sealed, earth-bermed, straw and sod-insulated iron cylinder with 1,080 cubic feet of interior volume, those 2 cows were generating 6,300 B2 per hour, around the clock every hour, without requiring a single piece of firewood. Add Britta and the 3 children, a resting adult produces about 400 B2 per hour, a child about 280. And the total continuous heat output inside that tank was somewhere between 7,500 and 8,000 B2 per hour, 24 hours a day. Medieval Europeans knew this. They'd known it for centuries before Britta Sundqvist was born. The longhouses of Dartmoor and Wales structures that have been excavated and reconstructed by English Heritage's archaeologists were built precisely on this principle. A single-roofed structure, with humans at one end and cattle at the other, separated by a cross-passage. The cattle's body heat drifted toward the human end. Medieval families didn't put their cows inside because they were sentimental. They did it because a single cow was worth roughly the same in sustained heat output as burning a cord of green wood through the winter, and the cow was alive in the spring to be worth something again. Britta didn't know about Dartmoor. She knew about the goat shed in January, and the chickens in the barrel, and the earth that stayed warm 4 feet down. She knew those things the way you know things when you've paid attention long enough and the consequences of being wrong are too high to risk. She moved her children into the tank on the 14th of November, 1880. Emil and Karin slept on a platform she'd built from rough-sawn cottonwood planks along the tank's inner curve, raised 18 inches off the floor, so the warmest air which rose from the cows directly below collected at their level. 4-year-old Pia slept between Britta and the wall of the tank, wrapped in 2 wool blankets. The cows stood in the straw at the opposite end. The smell was what you'd expect. Nobody mentioned it. The first morning inside the tank, Britta noted in the small journal she kept written in Swedish, in a hand so cramped the letters overlapped, that the temperature inside was warm enough that the children's breath made no fog. She didn't have a thermometer, but she knew from experience that human breath makes visible vapour below about 45 degrees Fahrenheit and doesn't above it. The inside of the tank was above 45 degrees on the 15th of November, 1880, at sunrise, with no fire lit, and an overnight outside temperature that had dropped to 9 above. That is a 3-6-degree temperature lift generated entirely by 2 cows, 3 children, and 1 adult woman in a sealed, earth-bermed iron shell. The man who was watching all of this, and not discreetly, was named Clement Forsyth. He had come to Holt County from Ohio in 1876 with capital. Not a great deal of capital by Ohio standards, but in Holt County, Nebraska, in 1876, $4,000 was enough to be a man whose opinion mattered. He owned 320 acres south of O'Neill, the largest herd of cattle in the immediate district at that time, 43 head, and a proper frame house with a board and batten exterior that he'd had sided with real milled lumber hauled up from Norfolk. Forsyth had watched Anders Sundqvist work the north section from a distance. He'd made one offer on the land in 1879, which Anders had refused. After Anders died and Gunnar Sundqvist refiled, Forsyth made another offer to Gunnar this time, which Gunnar accepted in principle, subject to the Land Commission approving the refiling. The southeast quarter Britta was on was not part of Forsyth's interest. It was too low, too flood-prone, too close to the Elkhorn to be worth serious grazing. But the spectacle of a widow and 3 children moving into an iron tank was not something Clement Forsyth was able to ignore, because it represented either a problem or an opportunity. If Britta survived the winter, she would be on the southeast quarter in spring. If she tried to file her own claim on it, which she had a legal right to do as a widow with dependents, it would complicate his eventual plans for consolidation. If she didn't survive, the southeast quarter would revert to public domain, and he could file on it himself in April. He rode over twice in November. The first time, he stayed on horseback 20 yards from the tank's hatch and asked Britta, politely, whether she'd considered moving the children to his house for the winter. He had 2 extra rooms, a proper stove, and a hired woman who cooked. He said it was not appropriate for children to be living in an old grain cistern. He said the smell alone was hazardous. Britta said, in the careful English she'd spent 7 years assembling word by word, that she appreciated his concern. She did not move. The second visit, in late November, Forsyth brought a man named Dowd, who was his hired foreman and who knew something about construction. Dowd looked at the banked-up mound of earth and sod and the hatch, walked a slow circle around it, and told Forsyth, loud enough for Britta to hear, "That thing's going to be 30 degrees colder than outside when the real cold hits. Iron draws heat out. She'll have iced the children solid inside a month." Forsyth relayed this assessment to Britta with what he appeared to believe was an expression of genuine concern. She looked at Dowd and then at Forsyth and said that she would send word if she needed anything. Dowd's physics were not entirely wrong about raw iron. An uninsulated iron tank in a Nebraska winter would in fact be brutal. Iron conducts heat 60 times faster than wood, 400 times faster than straw. A bare iron wall touching -20 air on one side would pull heat from a room faster than most fires could replace it. That part of Dowd's assessment was accurate. What he hadn't accounted for, what neither he nor Forsyth could see from outside, was that there was no iron touching the outside air. There was earth, sod, packed straw, 2 tons of manure. The iron wall was buried alive, touching nothing but insulation and the deep, stable ground that never dropped below 43 degrees. Dowd had evaluated the outside of what he was looking at. He had not understood what was on the other side of it. The winter announced itself properly on the 15th of October, 1880. This is documented. The Canton Advocate, published on October 21st of that year, described what happened that Thursday as the worst storm that Southern Dakota ever witnessed, a thunder-snow blizzard that came with lightning, a sky the color of old pewter going to yellow, and winds that drove the snow horizontally so that a man 20 feet from his front door lost the door. Drifts in the railroad cuts south of Yankton ran 15 to 25 feet. That was October. The territory hadn't even gotten to January yet. The Burlington and Missouri River Railroad line that connected O'Neill to the rest of the supply network went silent in late December. The trains stopped running. Not for a day, not for a week, for months. When the blizzards came through in January and February of 1881, they came through like furniture, through a window, fast, shattering, and leaving everything different. Snow fell on 47 of the 59 days in January and February, 1,881 across the region, not a dusting. Cumulative snowfall in many communities exceeded 11 feet. Railroad cuts filled 40 feet deep with packed drifts. The towns burned what they had: hay twisted into sticks, lumber from claim shanties, broken furniture, seed grain ground in coffee mills, because the flour supplies were gone. In O'Neill, the temperature dropped to -29 on February 2nd, and held within 5 degrees of that for the following 11 days. The Elkhorn River froze clear to the bottom in its shallower sections. Cattle died where they stood in open range and in inadequate barns. A man named Gust Rydberg on the claim 2 miles north of Britta lost all 14 of his cattle and both his horses in a single night when the north wall of his barn blew in and the temperature inside dropped to -14 before. Down. Petter Hoffman's father, Lars, who had the most substantial structure in the immediate area, a proper sod house with walls 2 feet thick and a good packed earth roof, ran out of firewood on February 7th. He had cut and stacked what he'd thought was more than enough. 3 cords of cottonwood, stored in the lean-to off the back of the house. The problem was that cottonwood in Holt County burns hot and fast. It has roughly 13.5 million BTU per cord, which sounds like a lot until you understand that means a cord disappears in about 4 weeks of constant burning at the rate needed to hold a sod house at 50 degrees in -20 weather. Lars's 3 cords lasted him through December and most of January, and then they were gone, and the nearest available timber was 11 miles away, under 4 feet of snow, with no road visible to get there. He burned his extra chairs. He burned the wooden frame of the extra bed. He burned the handles of tools he thought he could replace in spring. The inside temperature of the sod house dropped to 27 degrees, which is below freezing, which meant the water barrel froze, which meant the family had to melt snow 1 pot at a time on a fire of chair handles. They survived, but it was near. The southeast quarter of the old Sundqvist claim in late January 1881 looked like the surface of the moon after the blizzards had packed themselves down. The mound above the tank was 3 feet under snow, which made it invisible. It just looked like a slightly irregular rise in an otherwise white field. The hatch was the only indication of what was below, and Britta had weighted it with a flat limestone slab on the outside to keep it from being ripped off by wind, which meant to open it you had to lift 60 pounds of stone first. Inside, on January 31st, the temperature was 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Britta knew this because she had, since mid-November, been measuring the inside temperature the same way she measured everything, by observation. She kept a small cast-iron pot of water near the far end of the tank, away from the animals, away from the stove, away from the body heat of the family sleeping. If that pot froze overnight, she considered the temperature to have dropped below 32. It never froze, not once, through the entire winter of 1880 to 81. She burned the cook stove on only 11 days between November and March. Not every day, 11 days total, 4 to 6 hours each time, usually when the children had gotten damp from the animals or from breath condensation on the walls, and she needed to drive the humidity down and take the chill off. 11 burns. The single cord of cottonwood lasted her through April. The manure pile around the outside of the tank was changing. She could tell from the steam it sent up on cold mornings, a faint, thin vapour rising from the packed mound at the base of the iron walls. The composting was active. Even in a February that was trying to kill everything for miles around, the biological heat from 2 tons of decomposing horse manure was fighting back in its quiet, reliable, invisible way. The outer surface of the mound never froze solid. She checked it with a stick every morning. 4 inches deep, the material was still soft and slightly warm to the touch. Kerstin and Fru needed feeding, and that was the real daily labour of the winter, not keeping warm, but keeping the cows fed. She had put up 200 bales of prairie hay in September, stored in a low earthen-roofed storage bay she'd dug into the east side of the same rise the tank sat on, covered in sod. She rationed it, 4 bales a day between 2 cows, which she'd calculated would carry her to March 15th, and then she'd have to figure the rest. She was, in fact, right. She did figure the rest in early March, with 8 bales left. The weather broke enough to let the cows graze the south-facing slope, where the snow had thinned to 6 inches, and the dried grass beneath was still edible. Kerstin kept producing milk through January and February. Not as much as in summer. Britta got perhaps 1.5 quarts a day from her, where summer production had been closer to 4 quarts. But 1.5 quarts of whole milk per day, for a family of 4, through the worst winter in Nebraska's history, was the difference between the children staying healthy and not. Emil turned 10 in February. Karin got a cold in December and recovered in 3 days. Pia, the youngest, was the one Britta worried about most, 4 years old, small, still a year out from the kind of physical resilience that older children had. Pia slept the whole winter in the wool blankets Britta had brought, between her mother and the curving iron wall, and in the spring she was fine. She was fine because the air around her never dropped below 45 degrees, and she never went hungry, and she was not alone. The 12th of February 1881 was the coldest recorded temperature of the winter in the O'Neill area. The thermometer at the land office in O'Neill read -31 degrees Fahrenheit. That night, Clement Forsyth burned his dining table, not the chairs, first the table. He'd run through the chairs by February 8th, and the table was what was left besides the structural framing of the house itself. His hired foreman Dowd had left in January to winter in O'Neill proper, so Forsyth was alone in the frame house with his housekeeper, a German woman named Mrs. Klein Hempel, who was 70 yards away in the cook shed, and had not been to the main house in 4 days because the path between the buildings was impassable. Forsyth's frame house, board and batten, milled lumber, a proper construction, had essentially 0 insulating value once the temperature dropped far enough below its design range. Board and batten construction was standard, respectable, attractive. It was also, in a -31 night with a 30-mile-per-hour wind, a wooden box holding approximately the same heat as a wooden box. The interior dropped to 31 degrees. Forsyth slept in his overcoat with his dog on his chest for warmth, burning the dining table 1 chair-leg-sized section at a time. The milled, board and batten construction he'd been so proud of had an effective R value somewhere around R2 for the wall single-layer boards, a little batten, no insulation between. By contrast, the sod walls of Lars Hoffman's house, 2 feet thick, ran somewhere around R4 to R6 statically, plus the thermal mass benefit of the earth that kept the wall temperature relatively stable for days after a fire went out. And Britta's earth-bermed iron tank, with its 2 feet of straw and sod envelope, plus 4 feet of earth burial, was delivering something close to R8 to R12 statically, plus the constant mild heat from the ground itself and the animal bodies inside. The expensive house was the coldest. The buried iron tank with 2 cows was the warmest. On February 14th, Forsyth sent his hired hand, the one remaining man who hadn't left for O'Neill, to knock on Britta's hatch and ask whether she might have any surplus firewood. She did not have surplus firewood. She had the 11 remaining days of cottonwood she'd been budgeting carefully since November. She gave him 4 days' worth. She did not make a speech about it. She sent a meal up through the hatch with 4 armloads of split cottonwood and said, through a meal, that she hoped it helped. Forsyth's man said thank you and walked back through the snow. Forsyth came himself the following week, when the worst of it had broken slightly, and it was possible to move between claims without risking death by exposure. He stood at the hatch of the tank and looked at the mound it was buried under, and at the steam rising from the manure banking, and said nothing for a long while. Then he said that he owed her an apology and 4 days of firewood, and that he'd heard Dowd had been wrong. Britta said Dowd had been looking at the wrong part of the problem. The train reached O'Neill from the south in the first week of May 1881. The tracks had been cut off since late December, over 4 months of supply blockade. When the supply wagon made its first run north from O'Neill after the thaw, the driver, a man named Horace Pratt, told anyone who'd listen that the road south of town was lined on both sides with the carcasses of cattle that had frozen in the drifts and been uncovered by the spring melt. He said it looked like a battlefield. He wasn't wrong. The cattle losses in the Holt County area that winter were enormous. Ranchers who hadn't put up hay, and there were many, because the fall of 1880 had been relatively mild, and the grass had stayed green late, which made hay cutting feel less urgent, lost 50–60% of their herds. Gust Rydberg had nothing. 3 other homesteaders in the immediate area had nothing. Britta had Kirsten and Fru, both alive, both thin but functional. Kirsten started coming back to full milk production in April as the grass improved. The hay reserve had run to the wire but hadn't run out. She had the children, all 3 healthy. Pia had not been sick a single day since November. She had $6 of the original 11 because she'd spent 5 on supplies in October and nothing since then. And she had something that Clement Forsyth apparently spent most of March thinking about, because in April he rode over again and made her a proposition of a different kind than the ones he'd made before. He wanted to buy the southeast quarter. Not at the price it was worth as flood-prone Elkhorn bottomland. He offered her fair market value for comparable upland. $3.50 an acre, 40 acres, $140. He said he respected what she'd done and wanted to deal honestly. She said she needed until the following week to think about it. She spent that week walking the southeast quarter, looking at the soil near the river, checking the hay meadow that had grown back since the summer cut, measuring the distance from the Elkhorn to the high ground where the tank sat. Then she walked to O'Neill and spoke to the land commissioner, not the one who'd helped Gunnar with the informal conversation the previous fall, but a different man who'd taken the position in January and asked about her rights as a widow with minor children to file a homestead claim on the southeast quarter. She could. She was entitled. She filed on the 28th of April 1881 for 40 acres along the Elkhorn, listing herself as sole claimant and her 3 children as dependents. She paid the $14 filing fee from the money she'd kept in the flour tin. She told Forsyth she was keeping the land. He didn't argue. He may have understood by that point that arguing with her was not a productive use of his time. There's something specific about what Britta built that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's not actually complicated. It just looks complicated from the outside, because we've been trained to think of heating as something that requires fuel being consumed, fire, gas, oil, something burning. But heat has a source that predates all of those things and doesn't need to be bought or cut or hauled. It comes from living things. Every metabolizing body, every cow, every pig, every child breathing in a dark room is a furnace, a small one, but continuous. 12 hours a day, 24 hours a day, all winter. The problem with that heat is that it escapes. It flows outward through whatever contains the body, looking for equilibrium, for the temperature of the outside world. If the outside world is -30, the heat moves fast, and it takes everything with it. Britta's insight, and she wasn't the first person in human history to have it, though she arrived at it independently from observation rather than from a tradition passed down, was that you don't fight the direction heat wants to move. You slow it down enough that the bodies inside can maintain the temperature before it escapes. The earth does this. A foot of packed straw does this. A mound of composting manure does this. The iron tank was just the container, the shape that held all the insulation in place and gave the space its form. The Viking longhouses that archaeologists have excavated across Scandinavia and Iceland were doing exactly this in the 9th and 10th centuries. The byre houses of medieval Dartmoor were doing it in the 13th. The Mandan and Hidatsa earth lodges on the upper Missouri were doing it for centuries before any European homesteader arrived in Dakota Territory. The specific materials differ by what's available: turf in Iceland, granite slabs in Devon, cottonwood posts and packed earth in North Dakota. The physics is the same everywhere. An enclosed space with living bodies in it can maintain a survivable temperature with almost no additional fuel, as long as the shell around it slows the heat loss enough. The colder it is outside, the more important that shell becomes. At -10, a thin wall is uncomfortable. At -30, a thin wall is lethal. At -30, 2 feet of straw and packed earth, and the stable warmth of the deep ground is the difference between breathing in the morning and not. Britta's specific combination, the iron cylinder plus the manure banking plus the sod plus the earth burial plus the coupling to the 4-3-degree deep soil, had effective thermal performance that was, by modern estimates, competitive with a well-built sod house. Better, in some respects, because the iron gave her a rodent-proof and structurally rigid inner shell, and the convex dome of the cylinder shed snow-load naturally rather than accumulating it. The cook stove she used 11 times was the insurance. The real engine was 2 cows and the Nebraska ground. Britta Sundqvist proved up on the Southeast Quarter claim on the 28th of April 1886, exactly 5 years to the day from when she'd filed it. By that point she had added 30 acres of cropland, replaced the iron tank with a proper sodden timber house that she built with Emil's help in the summer of 1883, and was running 14 cattle of her own, a small herd, but hers. She lived on the claim until 1901, when Emil, then 29, took over the operation, and she moved to O'Neill to live with Karin, who had married a Norwegian-born grain merchant. She died in 1911 at 62, in a proper frame house with a good stove and more firewood than she needed, which was exactly the way she'd wanted things to go. The iron tank stayed on the property. Emil used it as a root cellar after the house was built, dug it into the hillside properly, covered it with 4 feet of earth, fitted it with a proper wooden door. He stored potatoes and turnips in it every winter until 1923, when the curved iron finally cracked along a seam from 43 years of freeze-thaw cycling, and the tank was broken up and sold to a salvage man from Norfolk for $3. By then, nobody in the area remembered it as anything other than a root cellar. Nobody remembered the winter of 1880 to 81, the way the people who'd been inside it remembered it, because the people who'd been inside it were gone or old, and memory goes where people go. But the physics remains. The 4-3-degree ground is still there, 4 feet down, in every county of the northern plains. A cow still puts out 3,500 BTU per hour. Straw still insulates at about R2 per inch. These are not historical facts, they are physical facts, which means they are true right now, today, regardless of what year the calendar says. The woman in the buried iron tank with 2 cows and 3 children figured that out in 1880 from watching chickens in a barrel and frost on a riverbank. She got there without any equipment except attention and time, and the particular kind of focus that comes from having no margin for being wrong, which is its own kind of education. maybe the most reliable kind there is.